The German Shepherd hit the end of the leash so hard the handler stumbled backward into a supply cart. Metal crashed. Vials rolled across the floor. 3 men, all trained, all decorated, couldn't hold a single dog. Shadow weighed 82 pounds and hadn't been in active service for 14 months, but right now he didn't look retired. He looked like something cornered and burning. Staff pressed against the walls. A doctor dropped his clipboard. And in the middle of all that chaos, a woman no one had noticed quietly set down her medication tray, walked toward the animal everyone else was running from, and sat down on the floor. If this story has you hooked already, subscribe and follow along until the very end. Hit like and drop a comment with the city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning started like most mornings at Harlow Veterans Medical Center, understaffed, overbooked, and running on recycled coffee and whatever goodwill hadn't been ground down by the night shift. Harlow sat on the eastern edge of Dunmore, a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest where the sky was almost always the color of a bruise, and the rain came sideways more often than not. The hospital served active duty personnel, veterans, and their families, and it had a particular reputation in the military community. Not for luxury, not for cutting-edge technology, but for the quality of its trauma unit. Harlow's trauma floor had pulled people back from the edge more times than the administration liked to count. It was quiet work, not glamorous, the kind of thing that didn't get framed and hung in the lobby. Emily Voss worked trauma on the 3rd floor, had done so for 6 years, and had never once been featured in any of the framed photographs in the lobby. She was 34, average height, with the kind of face that people forgot in a crowd. Not unattractive, just unremarkable by design. She'd stopped wearing her hair down years ago because it got in the way. She kept her badge clipped to her left pocket and her pen in her right, and she moved through the unit with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew exactly how much energy a shift required and refused to spend a single extra unit of it on performance. The other nurses respected her, mostly. A few of the newer residents had made the mistake of dismissing her early, then quietly revised that opinion after watching her work. The doctors who mattered knew what she was worth. The ones who didn't, well, they tended to be louder about it. She was documenting a medication chart at the nurses' station when the noise started. It wasn't immediate. It built the way bad things often do in hospitals, starting with one raised voice somewhere down the corridor, then another, then the unmistakable crash of something metallic hitting the floor. Emily didn't look up right away. Crashes happened. Raised voices happened. She finished the entry she was working on, capped her pen, and then looked up because the quality of the noise had changed. It had gone from disruptive to alarmed, which was a different register entirely. The hallway outside the East Wing examination suite was filling with people, but filling wrong, moving away from something rather than toward it, which meant whatever was happening in there was bad enough to override the professional instinct to help. Emily came around the station counter. She didn't run. She walked fast and she watched, because running blind into an unknown situation was how people got hurt. What she saw when she reached the edge of the small crowd that had gathered outside the examination suite doors. 3 men in military-issue clothing, 2 of them with thick leather leads wrapped around their forearms, all 3 of them losing a contest of strength with an 80-pound German Shepherd who looked like he was in the middle of a breakdown. The dog wasn't attacking. That was the first thing Emily clocked. He wasn't lunging at the men holding him. He was pulling away from them, away from the room, toward the hallway behind her with a kind of desperate, repetitive motion that looked less like aggression and more like panic. His hindquarters were low, his ears were flat, his eyes were white-rimmed and wild, scanning the corridor over and over as if he was looking for something he couldn't find. The men holding him were struggling, not because they were weak. They looked capable, military fit, the kind of handlers who'd done this before, but because a terrified animal doesn't fight the way a trained one does. It fights without logic and without limit, and that made it unpredictable. A 4th person stood near the far wall of the corridor with his arms crossed and a look on his face that Emily immediately cataloged as controlled frustration, poorly masking genuine worry. He was tall, close to 6 feet, with close-cropped silver hair at his temples, and the posture of someone who'd spent decades not being the one who needed help. He wore a uniform she recognized as Army officer. The rank insignia put him somewhere in the upper tier, though she didn't spend enough time in the military service wings to place it exactly. He He was watching the dog with the kind of expression people wore when something they cared about was falling apart in front of them and they didn't know how to stop it. Shadow. His voice was quiet, controlled. The dog didn't respond. Shadow, stand down. The shepherd, Shadow, apparently, jerked sideways and one of the handlers stumbled, and the supply cart at the edge of the hall went over with a crash that sent everyone in the corridor back another 2 steps. Emily stayed where she was. Dr. Paul Garrett appeared from the direction of the examination suite looking like he'd rather be anywhere on Earth. Garrett was the head of the physical rehabilitation department, 50s, blunt-featured, with a manner that managed to be both efficient and dismissive at the same time. He was good at his job. I was also the kind of person who categorized people quickly and rarely revised those categories. This is completely unacceptable, he said to no one in particular, or perhaps to the universe in general. We were told the dog was cleared for evaluation. We were told he was manageable. He is manageable, the silver-haired officer said, and there was a quiet edge in his voice that suggested Garrett had pressed on something he shouldn't have. With respect, Commander, manageable doesn't usually look like this. Emily moved a little closer to the door, not pushing through, just repositioning. She was trying to get a better angle on the dog's body language, and she needed to be closer to do that. Hey! A hand touched her arm. One of the nurses she recognized from the surgical ward, a younger man named Dex, who had a habit of inserting himself into things. You don't want to get near that. The handlers said he bit one of them earlier. Did they say where? What provoked it? Does it matter? Big military dog going nuts in a hospital hallway. It always matters, Emily said, not unkindly, and moved past him. She was close enough now to watch Shadow clearly. The bite story didn't track with what she was seeing. He wasn't in offensive mode. His posture was all wrong for that. The flattened ears, the low tail, the repetitive scanning. He was overwhelmed and looking for an exit that wasn't a threat. Someone had probably reached for him suddenly and gotten the warning they deserved, and now the word bite was floating around and distorting what was actually happening. Commander, whatever his name was, looked at her. It was a brief look, the kind that assesses and moves on. Garrett noticed her too. Nurse Voss. His voice had the flat quality it got when he was managing a situation he considered beneath him. This is outside your scope. You should return to... What's his medical history? Emily asked. Garrett blinked. Excuse me? Shadow. His medical history. Is he in pain? Any recent procedure? Change in medication? Hearing issues? A pause. Not a comfortable one. He's a retired military working dog here for a wellness evaluation, the commander said. He's been showing behavioral instability for approximately 6 weeks. This is the second evaluation he's refused. Refused how? The commander looked at her differently this time, slightly longer. Wouldn't enter the room. Today, he made it past the door before... this. A small gesture at the current chaos. Shadow had backed himself into the corner of the hallway now. Both handlers had managed to brace him, but the tension in the leads was clearly unsustainable. The dog's eyes moved in quick, desperate arcs, and Emily tracked what they kept returning to. Not the men holding him, not the equipment, not the room he'd come from, the hallway. A specific section of it, maybe 20 feet behind where she was standing. Has anyone checked what's in that direction? She asked, pointing back the way she'd come. Garrett made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I'm sorry, what? The dog keeps looking at that section of hallway. He's not trying to attack anyone. He's trying to get somewhere. Do you know if he's been in this building before? That's not relevant. Commander, Emily said, bypassing Garrett entirely. Has Shadow been in this building before? The silver-haired man was quiet for a moment. His expression shifted in a way she couldn't quite read. Yes, he trained here. Years ago. Before deployment. Emily nodded once. Something in that answer mattered, though she wasn't yet sure exactly how. Let me try something, she said. You're not a handler, Garrett said. You're not even assigned to this patient. He's not my patient. He's a visiting animal. And right now he's a safety situation that's going to escalate if those 2 men holding him don't get a break soon. She looked at the handlers directly. Both of them had the strained look of people who'd been muscling against dead weight for too long. How long have you been holding him? 20 minutes, the closer one said. His voice was controlled but tight. Okay. Emily turned to Garrett. I'm not asking to replace the handlers. I'm asking to attempt a de-escalation approach before someone gets hurt. If it doesn't work in 5 minutes, we try something else. Garrett opened his mouth. Let her try. The commander's voice was quiet and absolute. Garrett closed his mouth. Emily didn't acknowledge the small victory. She was already focused. She crouched down first, just inside the hallway, maybe 15 feet from where Shadow was braced in his corner. Crouching mattered. It dropped her out of the upright profile that read as threat or authority. She didn't look at the dog directly. She looked at the floor to his left, which put him in her peripheral field without creating the kind of sustained eye contact that would read as challenge. She didn't speak. She sat down on the floor. It took a beat for people to process what they were seeing. She heard someone make a quiet sound of disbelief behind her. She ignored it. The floor was cold and slightly gritty, and she registered that in the distant, practical part of her brain and set it aside. Shadow's frantic scanning slowed, not immediately. I was still breathing hard, still pressed into the corner, and one of the handlers still had tension on the lead. But the rapid, desperate movement of his eyes, that slowed within about 40 seconds of her sitting down. He looked at her, looked away, looked back. She waited. It was possibly the hardest thing she'd done all week, and she'd pulled a man back from septic shock 2 days ago, waiting while people stood behind her thinking she was either brave or foolish, or some combination that added up to useless. Waiting while a frightened animal processed the strange new information that someone had entered his crisis and then just stopped. One of the handlers shifted his weight. Shadow tensed again. Emily heard the handler start to ease the lead. Don't, she said very quietly. Wait. A pause. Then, Ma'am, I can't hold him much longer. You don't have to hold him. Loosen the lead. She heard the skepticism in the silence that followed. Not release. Loosen. Give him some slack. Another pause. Then, tentatively, the tension on the lead decreased. Shadow shook his head. A full-body, involuntary kind of movement, like something releasing, and looked at Emily again. She turned her palm upward on the floor. Open hand, not extended toward him, just visible. Passive. The dog took one step toward her. The corridor was completely silent. He took another step. And another. The handlers moved with him, carefully, maintaining the leads without the previous tension. Shadow stopped about 4 feet from Emily and stood there with his head slightly lowered, watching her with something that was no longer panic but hadn't yet resolved into calm. He was reassessing. Animals did that when the environment changed. They took inventory. Emily didn't move. She held the same position, same open palm on the floor, gaze slightly averted. After a long moment, long enough that she heard someone behind her exhale like they'd been holding it, Shadow closed the distance. He lowered his head and pressed it against her knee. The sound that came from somewhere in the crowd behind her was involuntary, collective. Not a gasp exactly, more like the air going out of a room. Emily brought one hand up slowly and rested it against the side of the dog's neck. She could feel his pulse under the fur, still fast, but no longer frantic. His breathing was slowing. The handlers exchanged a look, and one of them let more slack into the lead. Good boy, Emily said quietly. Not performatively. Just the truth, stated simply. Shadow leaned into her hand. It took another 10 minutes before he was calm enough to walk, and another 5 before the handlers got him into the examination suite without incident. Emily walked beside him the whole time, not taking the lead, not issuing commands, just present. Matching his pace, letting him check back on her every few steps, which he did, repeatedly, like someone who needed to keep confirming that the thing that made them feel safe was still there. Dr. Lauren Marsh met them inside. She was the hospital's veterinary consultant, a compact woman in her 40s who dealt mostly with therapy and service animals on the rehabilitation floor. She looked at Shadow, then at Emily, then at the commander who'd followed them in. Well, Marsh said, in a dry tone that suggested she'd learned to stop being surprised by things. That was different. Garrett was in the doorway. He looked like a man who had been wrong about something in front of witnesses and was determining how to proceed. The evaluation can continue, he said. His voice carried its usual flatness, but there was an edge under it that hadn't been there before. Nurse Voss, you can return to your floor. We'll take it from here. Emily nodded and stepped back from Shadow. Shadow's head came up immediately. He turned and tracked her movement with sudden, sharp attention. She stopped. The dog moved toward her, not frantically, not with the desperation of before, but with intent. He crossed the distance, circled her once, and sat down beside her left leg with the particular deliberateness that trained animals sometimes had, the kind of movement that looked almost like decision-making. Everyone in the room stared. "That's not," Garrett started. "Can you stay?" Commander Marcus Holt said. He'd introduced himself in the hallway while Shadow was calming, in the brief, military-efficient way of someone who had learned to exchange necessary information quickly for the evaluation. "I'm on shift," Emily said. "I'll clear it with your supervisor." He looked at Garrett briefly, which was not quite a challenge, but not quite not one either. Garrett made no argument. Whatever authority calculus he'd been running had apparently resolved in the commander's favor. Emily looked at Shadow, who looked back at her with calm brown eyes. "Okay," she said. "I'll stay." The evaluation took 40 minutes, and it would have been difficult to watch if you'd walked in without context. Shadow was not a young dog. He moved with the deliberate care of an animal carrying old injuries. There was a slight compensation in his rear left stride that Marsh noted and flagged, and when she pressed along his spine looking for tenderness, he flinched twice. But he was not aggressive. He was not unstable. He sat. He stood. He allowed handling. He'd refused from 3 trained specialists an hour earlier, and he did all of it because Emily was in the room. She didn't do anything particularly visible. She sat in a chair near the wall. She kept her posture relaxed. When Shadow looked at her, she acknowledged it. A look back, a quiet word. Occasionally a hand rested briefly on his head when he pressed close enough. Commander Holt watched all of it. He didn't speak much during the evaluation, but Emily noticed that he tracked Emily more than he tracked the examination. Not in a suspicious way exactly, more like a man who had encountered something he couldn't categorize and was refusing to file it until he understood it better. "You've done this before," Marsh said to Emily at one point, not a question. "Not professionally," Emily said. Marsh waited, clearly expecting more. Emily didn't give it. "How did you know to sit down?" Holt asked. He was standing near the door, and the question came out of a longer silence, as if he'd been turning it over for a while before releasing it. "He wasn't aggressive," Emily said. "He was overwhelmed. Those look similar from a distance, but they respond to completely different things. Standing over an overwhelmed animal tells them the threat is still present. Sitting down changes the information." Holt was quiet for a moment. "You weren't trying to control him," he said. "No." She paused. "I was trying to understand what he needed." Marsh made a small sound over her notepad that might have been agreement. In the corner, Garrett said nothing. Shadow, for his part, had positioned himself with his shoulder against Emily's left shin and had not moved from that spot in 20 minutes. The evaluation wrapped up with Marsh's preliminary findings. The dog was physically sound with manageable chronic joint issues, not dangerous, not a candidate for euthanasia or extreme behavioral intervention, and would benefit from a structured transition program for retired working animals. She recommended a follow-up in 6 weeks. Emily stood to leave. Shadow stood when she stood. "He's doing it again," one of the handlers said quietly. "I know." She crouched down and put both hands on the dog's face, the way she'd seen done with working breeds that knew human-facing interaction, firm and clear and specific. "Shadow, stay." The dog held eye contact with her for a moment that felt slightly longer than it should have. Then he sat. Emily straightened and walked toward the door. She was almost through it when Holt spoke again. "Nurse Voss." His voice had a different quality than before, less formal. "Thank you." She paused in the doorway. "He did the work. I just got out of the way." She was back on her floor and 3 charts deep into the afternoon backlog before she let herself think about what had actually happened. Not the dog, not the evaluation. She'd process all of that later, at home, alone, the way she processed most things. What she was thinking about was something specific. When she'd pressed her hand against Shadow's neck in that hallway, she'd felt something under her fingers besides his pulse. A harness, worn leather, well-maintained, standard issue for military working dogs. But the way he'd leaned into her hand, not relieved the way a frightened animal was relieved when a stranger was kind to them. The specific quality of it. Like he recognized her. She'd set that aside in the moment, because the moment required all of her attention. But she was thinking about it now. She was thinking about the way he'd circled her before sitting down. 1. Counterclockwise. She was thinking about how she knew that detail, which direction, which meant she'd seen it before, specifically before. She pulled her focus back to the chart in front of her. Her pen was steady. Her expression was the same it always was, but something had shifted behind her eyes in a way that was private and difficult to name, and she sat with it quietly for the rest of her shift without saying a word to anyone. Well, the incident, as people were already calling it by the dinner hour, which was how fast hospital floors processed anything outside the ordinary, had spread to at least 3 departments by 6 p.m. Emily was aware of this in the way she was aware of most things that circulated about her, at a slight remove, as information rather than experience. People talked. She didn't. What she was less prepared for was Garrett. He caught her in the corridor outside the medication room at 6:40, in the specific way that people caught you when they'd been positioning themselves to do so, which meant he'd been watching for her, which meant this wasn't casual. "The commander asked for your records," Garrett said. Emily paused. "My personnel file? Your training history, certifications, animal handling background." He said it like he was reading from something, like he'd memorized the list because the list surprised him. "That's a short list," Emily said. "That's what's strange." He had the look of a man recalibrating. Garrett didn't recalibrate easily or gracefully, and the visible effort of it was oddly humanizing. For someone with no formal animal handling background, what you did in there today was, "I sat on the floor," Emily said. "You sat on the floor and a dog that had been in crisis for 20 minutes walked up and went to sleep on your foot." He didn't go to sleep, figuratively. Garrett crossed his arms, then uncrossed them, which meant he was uncomfortable and couldn't decide how to position himself in the conversation. "Where did you learn that?" Emily considered the question for longer than she needed to. "It's not really something I learned," she said carefully. "It's more something I practiced a long time ago." Garrett waited. She didn't give him more. His jaw tightened slightly, and she recognized that as the specific frustration of someone who'd expected an answer and received a non-answer, and couldn't figure out whether the non-answer was evasion or genuinely all there was. "Commander Holt is requesting that you be assigned as a secondary contact for Shadow's follow-up visits," Garrett said. "I told him that was outside protocol." "Okay." "He said he'd take it above protocol." Emily said nothing. "I'm going to need you to understand," Garrett said, and his voice had shifted into something that was half warning and half something harder to name, that whatever happened today, it can't become a pattern. You have a floor to run. You have actual patients. "My patients were covered for the 40 minutes I was in that room," Emily said. "I checked before I went in." A pause. "I know," he said. He didn't say anything else. He walked away and Emily watched him go with the particular calm of someone who had learned a long time ago that certain conversations ended in the middle, with half things said and nothing resolved, and that this was not always the loss it appeared to be. She turned back to her work. Commander Marcus Holt was still in the building at 7 p.m., which she found out because he appeared at the nurse's station and asked for her by name with the direct efficiency of a man who didn't see the point of working through intermediaries. "I know you're finishing a shift," he said. "I won't take long." Emily gestured to the break room. It was empty this time of evening, most of the day staff already gone. He sat across from her at the break table. In the flat, unforgiving fluorescent light, he looked older than he had in the corridor, or maybe just more tired. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been visible in the contained intensity of the afternoon's crisis. He had a folder on the table in front of him, but he didn't open it. "Shadow has been with me for 9 years, Holt said. "He came to me when he was 18 months old. He finished training out of a facility in Central Oregon, and before that," he paused. "He was in a foster placement, part of the acclimation program for military working dogs, the families that take them before training starts." Emily was very still. "Most people don't know that program exists," Holt continued. He was watching her with the careful attention of a man who knew how to read what a face wasn't saying. "The dogs go to volunteer families, usually for 8 to 12 months, before they're ready for formal training. The idea is to get them stable, socialized, safe in a home environment before you ask them to handle everything else." The break room's ventilation system clicked on with a low hum. "Commander," Emily said. The facility that ran Shadow's pre-training placement was Cascade Valley, Holt said. The foster records are old, incomplete by modern standards. But the program director kept private records. He sent me what he had. He opened the folder. He turned it around so the photograph faced her. It was a Polaroid-style snapshot, slightly faded, showing a kitchen table with afternoon light coming in through windows. Emily recognized without being able to say why immediately. Because the recognition was in her body before it was in her mind. The particular angle of that light against those curtains. And at the table, a young dog with the distinctive dark saddle markings of a German shepherd, and a young woman with her arm around him, both of them looking at the camera. The woman was early to mid-20s in the photograph. Dark hair, lighter than it was now, relaxed in a way that Emily, looking at herself, almost didn't recognize. She looked at the photograph for a long moment. That was in his harness, Holt said. His voice was careful. In a small leather pouch on the inside lining. Someone put it there years ago, and it's been there ever since. A pause. I don't know if Shadow put it there, obviously, but someone who cared about him did. Emily set the photograph down. She had put it there. She'd done it the day before he left, the day the program coordinator had come to take him to the training facility, and she'd stood in that kitchen doorway and watched a dog she'd loved for 10 months walk away with someone else without looking back, because the not looking back was what they trained them to do. To go forward. To attach to the work and the handler and not the temporary safety of before. She had folded the photograph small and tucked it into the harness, not because she thought it would matter. She'd done it because she was 25 years old and she needed to leave something with him. She had never told anyone. I fostered him, she said. Holt nodded slowly. For 10 months, starting just after he was 18 months old. He had some fear responses they couldn't work through in the facility environment. They needed him in a home. My mother's house, technically. We were the second placement they called. A pause. He slept under my bed for the first 6 weeks. Wouldn't go outside without me. She looked at the photograph again. At the dog who had been afraid of the dark and woke her up in the night sometimes, just to confirm she was still there. He circled me, she said, before he sat down, counterclockwise. He always did that when he... She stopped. Holt was quiet. He recognized you, Holt said. That's what he was doing. He wasn't looking for a way out of the hallway. He was looking for you. The ventilation system clicked off. The break room was very quiet. Emily picked up the photograph carefully and looked at it for a moment longer. At the dog who had been afraid of everything and had grown into a decorated service animal. At the young woman who had been the bridge between those two things and had never known what became of him. She put it down. Outside in the corridor, a cart rolled past. A phone rang somewhere. The hospital went on being a hospital, as it always did, indifferent to the small, specific weight of what had just been understood in this break room, under this light, at this table. He found me, Emily said quietly. It wasn't really a question, but Holt answered it anyway. Yeah, he said. I think he did. Yeah, he said. I think he did. The photograph stayed on the table between them for a long moment, neither of them reaching for it. Outside in the corridor, an overhead light flickered once and steadied. Someone laughed somewhere down the hall. A short, tired sound, the kind that came at the end of long shifts when people found anything funny, because the alternative was not finding anything funny at all. Holt picked up the photograph and slid it back into the folder. He did it carefully, which Emily noticed and filed away without comment. I'm going to be honest with you, he said. I've worked with a lot of handlers, a lot of specialists, people who have dedicated their entire careers to military working dogs. He paused. What you did today, sitting down on that floor, most of them wouldn't have thought of that, and the ones who would have thought of it would have second-guessed themselves out of it. Emily said nothing. That's not a critique of them, Holt added. It's just true. There's a kind of training that teaches you to project authority. And sometimes projecting authority is the wrong answer, and knowing the difference is, it's not a credential, it's something else. Commander, she kept her voice even. I appreciate what you're saying, but today was a specific situation with a specific animal. I don't want you to extrapolate from it more than it warrants. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression shifted, not quite amusement, but the near neighbor of it. You're not comfortable with this. I'm fine. I don't mean uncomfortable in a difficult way. I mean, you don't know what to do with being acknowledged. It makes you want to minimize. Emily picked up her pen from the table. She didn't have a chart in front of her, but her hands needed something to do. I need to finish my shift notes. Holt stood. He tucked the folder under his arm. Shadow's follow-up is in 6 weeks. I'd like you to be there. Talk to Garrett. I have. He said no. I'm talking to you. A pause. Think about it. He left. Emily sat alone in the break room for approximately 3 minutes, which was about 2 minutes and 50 seconds longer than she normally allowed herself to sit anywhere doing nothing. Then she picked up the photograph he'd left behind. She realized a moment later he'd done it intentionally, and looked at it one more time before folding it and putting it in her breast pocket. She went back to her shift notes. The story moved the way stories did in a hospital, wrong, fast, and decorated with details nobody had verified. By the following morning, the version circulating through Harlow's lower floors had Shadow as a former combat dog who'd been involved in 3 overseas operations and had once taken a bullet for a field medic. Emily, in this version, had subdued him using some kind of specialized handling technique she'd learned during a sabbatical that nobody could quite specify the nature of. There was a version that had her whispering something in the dog's ear. There was a version, improbably, where Garrett had specifically requested her intervention rather than resisting it. None of this was accurate. Emily was aware of all of it and said nothing to correct any of it, which was partly pragmatism and partly the understanding that corrections rarely traveled as fast as the stories they were meant to fix. What was accurate, Commander Holt had filed a formal request with hospital administration for Emily to serve as civilian liaison during Shadow's transition period evaluations. This was an unusual request. The hospital's administrative office had apparently spent the better part of an early morning call determining whether it fell within existing protocol and had concluded, tentatively, that it could be accommodated under the medical civilian cooperation framework that the hospital operated under with certain veteran-linked programs. Garrett had also apparently made a counter-argument. Emily found out about this the same way she found out about most things, from Dex, who had the situational awareness of a person who never missed anything, and the restraint of someone who had never tried to develop any. He said it sets a precedent, Dex told her, appearing beside her at the medication cart with the reliability of someone tracking her schedule. That letting nursing staff take on advisory roles in non-patient care situations creates liability exposure. He's not wrong about that, Emily said, but he also said, Dex dropped his voice. He said you probably had no idea what you were doing and got lucky, that the dog was calming down anyway. Emily unscrewed a vial and drew the measured dose without looking up. Was he calming down? No. Dex said it immediately, which was honest and somewhat more animated than his usual register. He absolutely was not calming down. I was standing there. One of the handlers had a tear in his jacket from where the lead snapped back. Okay? Okay? Dex stared at her. That's all you have? What would you like me to say? I don't know. Something. He gestured vaguely. He's actively telling people you got lucky, that it wasn't skill, that a veterinary professional should have been called in first. A veterinary professional was called in, Emily said. Dr. Marsh. She was in the evaluation. She ran the examination. That's not the point. Dex. She capped the vial and looked at him. I have 17 patients today, and one of them is post-surgical and running a temperature I don't like. I don't have bandwidth for this. He subsided, but he had the look of someone who had more to say and was only temporarily containing it. Emily moved on to the next medication. The thing she didn't say. The thing she was actively not spending energy on, because spending energy on it would require acknowledging how much it irritated her, was that Garrett's version of events had already reached the kind of people who shaped opinions in hospitals without necessarily having all the relevant information. 2 residents had looked at her differently at morning handover, not with hostility, with the particular blankness of people who were recalibrating based on information they'd received from a source they trusted and hadn't thought to question. She knew that blankness. She'd navigated it before. She'd learned over 6 years that the most effective response to it was continued competence and the patience to wait for people to update their own assessments. This was a cold comfort at 7:40 in the morning with 17 patients and a post-surgical fever, but it was the comfort she had. Room 14 was where she found the fever. His name was Sergeant First Class Dale Owens, 51 years old, 4 days out of a hip replacement following a training accident that had left the original joint unsalvageable. He was a compact, weathered man with a dry sense of humor he deployed as a defense mechanism, and a genuine dislike of being in the hospital that he managed to express about once every 40 minutes through some variation of the same complaint. "It's too hot in here," he said when Emily came in to check his temperature. "The room's at 68, she said. "Then my thermometer's broken." She checked his actual temperature. 100.9. Not alarming yet. Alarming adjacent. "How's the incision site?" she asked. "Fine." "That's not what I asked." A pause. "Tender. More than yesterday." Emily examined the incision. The skin around it was slightly warmer than the surrounding tissue, which was not dramatically outside the normal post-surgical range, but combined with the fever. She noted it, she charted it, and she went to find the attending. The attending was Dr. Nadia Forsyth, who was good and who was also managing 23 patients across 2 floors and had the focused, slightly too fast energy of someone running on competence and caffeine. Emily laid out her observations in the efficient, precise way she'd spent years developing, not long enough to waste time, not short enough to miss anything. Forsyth ordered a culture. She increased monitoring frequency. She said with the directness Emily appreciated in her, "Good catch. Let's see what it shows." It wasn't a crisis. It was a flag, carefully raised before it had to become one. This was most of what nursing was, in Emily's experience. Not the dramatic interventions. Those happened, and she was good at them, but they were the exception. The work was mostly this, paying attention to the things that weren't crises yet, before they were, so that fewer of them became crises. It was the kind of work that was invisible when it went well, which it usually did, which meant it was usually invisible. She went back to her other 16 patients and moved through the morning with the steady, unglamorous efficiency that was her default mode. Holt returned to the floor at 11:30, which she didn't expect. He wasn't in uniform this time, which made him look both more and less like himself. Civilian clothes, still carrying himself like someone who didn't fully believe in non-military environments, which gave him a slightly misaligned quality, like a piece of furniture in the wrong room. He stopped at the nurse's station and asked for her with the same directness as before, and Dex, who had apparently appointed himself the unofficial monitor of Emily-adjacent developments, came to find her in the supply room with a look that managed to convey information, surprise, and a suppressed desire to know more, all simultaneously. "The commander's here," he said. "I know who it is." "I'm just saying that—" "Thank you, Dex." Holt was looking at the corridor's information board when she found him, the one with the department directories and the visitor protocols, which was not interesting enough to be actually worth looking at. He turned when he heard her approach. "I should have called," he said. "I know you're working." "What happened?" He registered her directness without reaction. "Nothing urgent. Shadow had a difficult night. Wouldn't settle. The facility I'm temporarily housing him at, it's a good facility, but it's not what he's used to. I wanted to discuss the transition protocol with Dr. Marsh, and I wanted to—" He paused. "I wanted to ask you something first." Emily waited. "During his time with you," Holt said, "the foster period, what did he respond to? Specifically, what were the things that settled him?" She thought about it for a moment, and she thought about it genuinely rather than reaching for the easy answer. Routine, mostly. He needed to know what was coming, any unpredictability, even good unpredictability, like a surprise treat or a change in the walk route, would set him back. He needed the sequence to be the same. A pause. He slept better with low sound. Not silence. Silence seemed to bother him, actually, but low, consistent sound, radio usually, something that just continued. Holt was listening with the focused quality of someone recording. "What else?" "He was a leaner," she said. "That probably hasn't changed. When he's stressed, he needs contact, not being held. He didn't like being held, just weight. Shoulder against a leg, side against a wall, something solid that he could press into." "He does that," Holt said. "He does it with me now." Something shifted in his expression, not quite discomfort, more like the recognition of something he hadn't put into those terms before. "I didn't know that was a thing. From before." "It probably is," Emily said. "The early responses tend to persist." They stood in the corridor for a moment, and it was a strange kind of moment. Not quite personal, not quite professional, located in the space between those things where conversations about animals who mattered to both parties sometimes ended up. I'm going to push for the liaison designation, Holt said. Formally, I want you to know that, regardless of what Garrett says. You don't need to do that on my behalf. I'm not doing it on your behalf. I'm doing it because Shadow trusted you in 40 seconds when he wouldn't trust 3 trained handlers in 20 minutes, and that's data. And I take data seriously. Emily looked at him for a moment. You're going to get pushback. I always get pushback. He said it simply, without complaint. I've been getting pushback about Shadow for 6 months. People who think a retired working dog's psychological well-being is not a priority worth the administrative friction. A pause. They're wrong. She didn't have a response for that particularly. It was the kind of statement that didn't need one. Think about it, he said, the same as the night before. He went to find Dr. Marsh. Emily watched him go for just a moment before turning back to her floor, and she was almost to room 14 to check Owen's temperature again when she heard Garrett's voice from the corridor behind her. Not directed at her, directed at someone else, carrying the way voices in hospital corridors always did when people forgot about the acoustics. The commander can request whatever he wants, Garrett was saying. Administration will process it. That doesn't mean it gets approved. A short pause. She's not a specialist. She's not trained in this. What happened yesterday was luck, and nobody who was actually watching it is going to pretend otherwise. The someone he was talking to made an inaudible response. I've sent a formal objection, Garrett continued, and I've CC'd risk management. If something goes wrong during one of these evaluations because an unqualified staff member was used in a specialist capacity, the liability exposure is, I've already laid it out. They'll see it. Another inaudible response. She's a competent nurse, Garrett said. The word competent landed in a specific register. Not dismissive exactly, but limiting. The way you might call something adequate. The way you might describe something as useful in its place. But she's a floor nurse. That's her place. And if she starts believing she's something else because of one afternoon with a dog, that's a problem. Emily had stopped walking. She was aware that she had, and she was aware that being caught stopped outside an overheard conversation about herself would look a particular way, so she started walking again before the moment could calcify. She went into room 14, checked Owen's temperature, 100.7, slightly lower, culture still pending, and wrote it in the chart with her usual handwriting, which was small and precise and gave nothing away. You okay? Owens asked. Fine. You've got a look. What look? He studied her for a moment with the unhurried assessment of a man who had spent decades reading people under pressure. The look where everything's actually fine. Emily looked at him. That doesn't make sense. It does if you know what I mean. She closed his chart. Temperature's down a point. That's mildly good. Culture results should be back this afternoon. She moved toward the door. Nurse Voss. She paused. I've been in enough hospitals to know the difference between the people who are actually good at this and the people who just look good at it, Owen said. You're good at it? The real kind? He said it without sentiment, with the flat honesty of someone dispensing a fact they had no particular interest in dressing up. I don't know what's going on out there, and it's not my business, but I thought that was worth saying. Emily was quiet for a moment. Rest, she said. I'll be back at 3. She went back into the corridor. She was good at not carrying things. She'd learned it out of necessity. You couldn't do trauma work for 6 years without developing the ability to separate the emotional content of a day from the functional performance of it. But sometimes the separation was easier than others. And this was one of the harder times because what Garrett had said in the corridor was not the first time she'd heard a version of it. She'd heard versions of it for 6 years in various registers, sometimes openly, sometimes implied, sometimes dressed up in the language of institutional protocol or scope of practice or liability management. The words changed. The shape of what they meant did not. She is competent. She is useful in her place. She should not mistake herself for something more than she is. She had gotten good at not arguing with those versions. Arguing was expensive and rarely moved things the direction you needed them to move. The better response was to be correct consistently and let that speak at a pace she couldn't control. She had done that for 6 years. She was still doing it today. The culture came back at 2:58. Emily was on the floor when the results appeared in the system, and she was in Forsyth's office 4 minutes later with the chart in hand. Surgical site infection. Early stage. The organism was susceptible to first-line antibiotics, which was the good version of this finding. The version where you caught it before it became something that didn't have good versions. Forsyth looked at the results and then at Emily with an expression that was brisk and sincere at the same time. How early did you flag this? 7:45 this morning. It was marginal. I wasn't certain. But you flagged it. I flagged it. Forsyth was already reaching for the prescription pad. This could have been a mess by tomorrow. Good instinct. She wrote quickly. I'll go talk to Owens. Can you prep the IV setup? Already ordered the supplies. Forsyth looked at her again. Of course you did. It wasn't dismissive. It was something closer to tired appreciation. The recognition that some people did the next step before being told to, and that this was rarer than it should have been. Emily went to prep the IV. She was in the supply room, hands organized and moving with the precise efficiency of long practice, when Dex appeared in the doorway. Dr. Garrett, he said, in a tone that was attempting to be neutral and failing at it. He's talking to administration, right now, like actually in the meeting. Emily kept her hands moving. I know. About the liaison thing. I know, Dex. He's bringing the liability angle, and he brought a pause. He brought in someone from credentialing to talk about scope of practice. Emily paused, just briefly. Who's in the meeting from administration? She asked. Director Calloway and the department heads, and Commander Holt. Dex hesitated. And Dr. Marsh and someone from the military liaison office that I don't recognize. Emily secured the IV bag and gathered the supplies into a tray. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. It was the kind of steadiness that came from years of developing it under conditions that demanded it, not the kind that came naturally. Dex, she said. Yeah? Thank you for telling me. He looked like he wanted to say more. He didn't. She went to room 14 and set up the IV with quiet precision, explained to Owens what the culture had found and what they were doing about it, and why catching it now was the right version of this situation, answered his questions, which were precise and practical, the kind of questions that came from someone who dealt with medical situations in non-comfortable settings and learned to ask for the information that actually mattered, and left him more informed and somewhat less aggravated than she'd found him. She was back at the nurses' station when Holt appeared from the direction of the administrative corridor. He didn't look satisfied. He didn't look defeated either. He looked like a man in the middle of something that wasn't finished. Calloway wants a formal proposal, he said, stopping in front of the station. An official request with documented rationale, scope clearly defined, liability explicitly addressed. He paused. It's not a no. It's not a yes either, Emily said. No. He looked at her steadily. I'm going to write it tonight. I'd like your input. Will you have time tomorrow? Emily looked at her board. At 17 patients, one of whom was now on IV antibiotics, and the rest of whom would have a full range of needs in the morning. She thought about Garrett's voice in the corridor. Competent, in her place. She thought about what it meant to fight that version of things by doing the same thing in the same way for 6 more years, and whether that was enough, and whether she actually believed it was, or had just learned to act like she believed it, because the alternative was harder to live with. She thought about a photograph in a small leather pouch in a dog's harness, carried for 9 years. 7 a.m., she said. Before shift. I have 30 minutes. Holt nodded once. I'll be here. He left. Emily turned back to her board. The day was not over yet. At 5 p.m., she was completing final rounds when the text came through on her personal phone, a notification she didn't recognize the number for, which normally she would have dismissed, but the preview line in the notification stopped her. It read, I think you should know what Dr. Garrett is actually saying about you in that proposal. She stood in the corridor outside room 14 and looked at the notification for a moment. Then she opened it. The number was unfamiliar. The message was brief, and it read like someone who was typing quickly and with purpose. He's not just arguing scope of practice. He's telling Calloway that you inserted yourself into a critical situation without authorization, that you interfered with trained professionals, and that you did it for attention. He's framing it as a disciplinary issue. He's suggesting you be formally reprimanded. I know because I was in the room. Emily read it twice. She did not recognize the number. She didn't know who had been in that room. She didn't know if this was accurate, incomplete, misread, or constructed out of someone's particular version of events filtered through whatever lens they carried. She did know one thing. She was alone in a corridor at 5 p.m. with 17 patients behind her and a meeting she hadn't been invited to that may or may not have just put a formal reprimand in her file. The phone was still in her hand when the overhead intercom activated with the flat procedural tone it always used, and the voice that followed was the one that still, after 6 years, sent a specific alertness through her the same way it always had. Code Blue, Room 22. Code Blue, Room 22. All available personnel. Room 22 was at the end of the corridor she was already standing in. She was running before the announcement finished. Room 22 was 30 feet down the corridor, and she covered it in seconds, pushing through the door into the controlled chaos that a Code Blue always was. Not the panicked, cinematic version of chaos, but the real kind, which was actually people moving in multiple directions with purpose, while the room itself felt suddenly too small and too loud, and not equipped for this exact moment. The patient in room 22 was Staff Sergeant Ruben Alcala, 63 years old, 3 days post-cardiac catheterization for a blockage that had been caught before it became a full infarction. He had been on monitoring. He had been stable. He was not stable now. The cardiac monitor was screaming a flatline rhythm that wasn't actually flat. It was ventricular fibrillation, which looked like noise and was, in the most literal sense, the heart forgetting how to do its job. He was unconscious. His color was wrong in the specific way that cardiac arrest turned people wrong. The gray-blue that meant the oxygen had stopped moving where it needed to go. Emily processed all of this in approximately 3 seconds. The night shift aide who had found him was pressed against the wall near the door with the look of someone who had followed the code training exactly and was now waiting to be told what to do next. 2 other nurses had arrived seconds behind Emily, Priya from the surgical floor, and a younger one she recognized as Tomlin, 3 months on the unit, who had the careful, wide-eyed focus of someone doing everything they'd been taught while some portion of their brain screamed at them. "Priya, compressions," Emily said, already moving to the crash cart. "Tomlin, bag him, proper seal." Priya moved without hesitation. She was small and she was strong, and she had the particular mechanical consistency that good chest compressions required. Full depth, full release, the rate that kept blood moving through a heart that had stopped coordinating with itself. Tomlin got the bag valve mask positioned. His hands were not quite shaking. Almost, but not quite. Emily had the defibrillator charged in the time it took the monitor to cycle through one more reading. She confirmed the rhythm, still VF, still no change, called clear, waited for the half-second that felt much longer, and delivered the shock. Alcala's body moved with it the way bodies did, which was not like the movies. Less dramatic. More like a single involuntary contraction and then stillness. The monitor continued its alarm. "Resume," Emily said, and Priya was already back to compressions before the word finished. Dr. Forsyth arrived 40 seconds after the first shock. She came in fast, and she came in calibrated. Emily watched her take in the room in the same rapid assessment way she always did, and begin issuing orders in the clipped, specific register of someone who had run codes before and knew that the space between words was time they couldn't get back. "Epi's ready," Emily said before Forsyth asked. Forsyth looked at her once. "Push it." Emily pushed the epinephrine. 2 minutes of compressions. Check rhythm. Still VF. Second shock. Priya resumed compressions without being told. The room had found its rhythm. Not comfortable, not easy, but functional. The specific terrible function of a team keeping a man alive while his heart decided whether it wanted to come back. "Between the second and third cycle," Forsyth said, without looking up from the monitor. "When did you know?" "I didn't know this," Emily said. "I flagged Owens this morning for a culture that came back positive." Different patient. 14. A pause. The monitor continued. "Anyone looking at 22's potassium this morning?" Emily didn't answer right away because she was already reaching for the chart on the side table, the physical backup that was always printed for long-term monitoring patients, and scanning the morning labs. The numbers were there. Potassium had been on the lower end of acceptable, not flagged, not acted on. 3.2 this morning, she said. Forsyth's jaw tightened slightly. "That's a VF risk in a post-cath patient. Yes." Whose morning rounds? Emily said nothing, because the name she was reading on the morning sign-off was Garrett's resident. A second year. Assigned to Garrett's teaching cohort. Someone who had been trained, presumably, to look at that number in the context of this patient's history, and who either had not or had not understood what they were looking at. Check rhythm, Forsyth said. Emily looked at the monitor. The waveform had changed. Not to normal sinus, to a junctional rhythm, which was ugly and unstable but was not VF. It was the heart taking back the wheel in a shaking, uncertain hand. Hold compressions, Forsyth said. Priya stopped. Everyone looked at the monitor. Pulse check. Emily had 2 fingers on Alcala's neck before the instruction finished. I've got a pulse, she said. Weak. Present. The room exhaled. It wasn't over. It was never over after a code, not really. It became a different kind of work. The stabilization, the labs, the transfer to the ICU with the team that would take over the next phase of keeping him alive. There were phone calls to make, family to notify, documentation that had to be completed while the memory was fresh enough to be accurate. Emily did her portion of all of it, not the whole of it. Forsyth carried the weight of the decisions. But the work that fell within Emily's scope she did with the same focused, efficient quality that she always did. She had adrenaline moving through her that she wasn't going to process until later. She knew that, and she set it aside with the practiced ease of long habit, which wasn't the same as not feeling it. It was more like knowing which drawer to put something in so you could find it later. The transfer team took Alcala at 6:17. He was alive. He was in poor shape, but he was alive, which was the foundational requirement for everything else. Emily went to the bathroom, washed her hands, washed her face with cold water, and looked at herself in the mirror for about 5 seconds. Then she dried her face and went back to the floor. Forsyth found her at 7:05, between the end of Emily's shift and the beginning of the handoff. Sit down, Forsyth said. Emily sat. Forsyth sat across from her at the nurse's station, the main one, not the break room, which meant this was at least semi-official, or Forsyth wanted it to feel that way. She had the chart in her hand and a particular look on her face, the one she got when she was being precise on purpose. The potassium level, Forsyth said. Dr. Garrett's resident flagged it as borderline. His note says borderline acceptable for a monitoring patient. He was working from Garrett's guidance. I know. You weren't on Alcala's team. No, Owens is in 14. I was focused on 14. Emily paused. If I had been on 22, I would have flagged the potassium. Because in a post-cath patient with his arrhythmia history, 3-2 isn't acceptable even if it reads as borderline in the range. It's acceptable in a healthy adult. It's not acceptable in him. Forsyth was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. I know you would have. And I know you weren't his nurse. She set the chart down. But I need to ask, was there a moment today where you saw his chart for any reason, in passing, or... No, Emily said. I had 17 patients. I didn't have occasion to look at his chart. Okay. Forsyth nodded once. That's what I thought. I needed to hear you say it. She paused. What happened today in that room, the way the team ran that code, that was good work. That was the kind of work that doesn't happen without people who know what they're doing at every level. Emily said nothing. You called the correct interventions before I arrived, Forsyth said. You had the rhythm identified, the cart accessed, the first shock delivered. You're not the attending. You don't make those calls officially. But if you hadn't moved the way you moved, Alcala probably doesn't make it to ICU alive. And that's not... I want to be careful about how I say this. That's not me telling you to exceed your scope in the future. It's me telling you that your scope, used correctly, is what kept that man alive until I got there. It was a careful thing to say. Emily recognized the carefulness and what it required from Forsyth, the precision of acknowledging a thing without creating a precedent that caused institutional problems. Thank you, Emily said. Go home, Forsyth said. You've had a day. She didn't go home immediately. She sat in the parking structure for approximately 11 minutes with her keys in her hand and the engine off, doing the processing she'd been deferring all afternoon. The adrenaline from the code, the text message, which was still on her phone, which she still hadn't replied to. Garrett's voice in the corridor, the shape of what it meant and the way it had landed differently than those words had landed before. because something about the specific combination of today had worn through the insulation she'd built around that particular wound. She was competent. She was in her place. She had just run a code in the time it took the attending to arrive. She had caught a surgical site infection that was going to be a significant issue by morning if left until morning. She had sat on a cold hospital floor and talked a frightened dog into stillness when 3 trained handlers couldn't. And somewhere in that hospital, a formal complaint was possibly sitting in her file describing what she'd done as attention-seeking and unauthorized. She looked at her phone. At the unknown number, she typed, "Who is this?" The response came in under 2 minutes. Someone who was in that meeting and thought you should know. I'm not going to say more than that, but document everything from today. Every intervention, every time and outcome. Do it now, while it's fresh. Emily read it twice. She opened her notes app and started writing. Bob. She was at the hospital at 6:45 the next morning, which was earlier than her shift and earlier than she'd told Holt, and she used the extra 15 minutes to speak to the night charge nurse and get a status on Alcala, stable in ICU, potassium corrected, cardiac team reviewing, and to add 2 items to the documentation she'd 6:58. He had the proposal draft on a tablet. He looked like a man who had worked until late and not slept much, but whose baseline energy didn't require much sleep to maintain. He sat across from her in the break room and showed her what he'd written, and she read it with the efficient thoroughness she brought to everything, and when she was finished, she looked up. "He's filing a formal complaint about my conduct in the first evaluation," she said. Holt was quiet for a moment. "Where did you hear that?" "Someone who was in the meeting." "Do you know who?" "No." He was quiet for a moment longer. Then, "Yes. He's filing on the grounds of scope violation, unauthorized intervention. He's framing it as a liability issue." A pause. What he's not saying explicitly, but is clearly the subtext, is that he wants your formal liaison designation denied, and he wants the incident on record as something that makes future similar designations difficult to argue for. Emily looked at the table. "He's not wrong about the scope question," she said. It cost something to say. "Technically, I'm a floor nurse. The authorization chain wasn't clear." "The commander of a military working dog unit asked you directly to assist," Holt said. "That's documented. That's my request and my authorization. Does a military officer's verbal request constitute institutional authorization in a civilian hospital?" Holt's expression shifted slightly. He hadn't expected her to make that argument, possibly because most people who were being defended didn't argue against their own defense. "No," he admitted, "not formally." So he has a procedural point. A procedural point he's using to bury something that was clinically and practically the right call. "Yes," Emily said. "That's how it usually works." They sat with that for a moment. The break room's coffee maker gurgled. Somewhere outside the door, the hospital was starting its morning. "I ran a code last night," Emily said. "Ventricular fibrillation, post-cath patient. I was first on scene. I defibrillated before the attending arrived." Holt looked at her. "Alcala's stable in ICU. Forsyth noted in her report that the early intervention was critical to outcome." She paused. "And I caught a surgical site infection in another patient, Fortin, early enough that it's being managed on first-line antibiotics instead of becoming a systemic problem." "That's yesterday," Holt said. "That's yesterday," Emily agreed. "That's also 2 examples of what it looks like when someone with the right instincts is in the right place." He looked at her with the steady, taking inventory expression she was getting used to. "You're building a counter-record." "I'm documenting my work," she said. "I document my work every day. Yesterday I was more thorough about it." A pause. Something shifted in his expression that was harder to name than his usual controlled commander mode. Something closer to respect, or perhaps the specific respect that came from watching someone handle a disadvantaged position with intelligence rather than panic. "I have contacts in military medical oversight," he said. "Not a threat. I'm not trying to leverage anything inappropriate. But if Garrett's formal complaint creates a record that follows you, there are channels through which Shadow's evaluation and your role in it can be formally documented from the military side, independent of Harlow's institutional opinion." Emily thought about this. That could make things worse here. It could. Or it could create a parallel record that protects you if this escalates beyond Garrett. "You do that," Emily said. It came out flatter than she intended. Not skeptical exactly, more like trying to locate the shape of the offer. I look after the people who look after my team, Holt said simply. Shadow's my team. You looked after him. The break room door opened. Dex looked in, saw them, and had the self-awareness to look apologetic. Sorry, Dr. Forsyth is looking for you, he said to Emily. Something about the Alcala file. Emily stood. She looked at Holt. The proposal, she said. Paragraph 3, the scope definition. It's too broad. Tighten it to evaluation support only. Don't include ongoing case consultation. It's a smaller ask and harder to argue against. Holt looked at what she'd marked. That limits what I'm requesting. It also limits Garrett's surface area for attack. She pushed the tablet back toward him. Small and defensible is better than large and vulnerable. She went to find Forsyth. Forsyth's concern turned out to be administrative rather than medical. The Alcala documentation required Emily's direct addendum since she'd run the initial code response, and there was a specific form that Forsyth needed signed and dated with times of intervention. Emily signed it accurately and completely, noting each action and the time. Forsyth looked at the completed form. The potassium call, she said carefully. Do you know how long Garrett's resident has been on the teaching rotation? 8 weeks, Emily said. She'd checked. And the guidance he was working from. You'd have to talk to Garrett. Forsyth looked at her with the specific expression of someone who had already talked to Garrett and found the conversation unsatisfying. She said, which in Forsyth's vocabulary covered a lot of ground. Emily left it there. She was halfway through her morning rounds when Dex appeared again. He had a particular energy today, wound tighter than usual, which was how she knew something had moved before he said what it was. Garrett's resident, Dex said in a low voice, walking beside her. Apparently he's not... He talked to someone last night. About the potassium. About the code. He paused. He's saying Garrett told him explicitly not to bump borderline labs in monitoring patients unless they crossed the formal threshold, that it created unnecessary consults. Emily kept walking. He documented it, Dex said. The conversation, in his personal log. He sent a copy to Forsyth this morning. Emily stopped walking. She turned to look at Dex, who looked back at her with the particular energy of someone carrying news that was still in the process of becoming what it was going to become. He sent it to Forsyth, she said, and to the resident director of the training program. A pause. Not to Garrett. Emily resumed walking. Her mind was running calculations she didn't speak aloud. If the resident's account was accurate, then the potassium call, the one that had preceded Alcala's code, wasn't a trainee oversight. It was the result of specific guidance that had been given and followed, which meant the question of who bore responsibility for that outcome was going to move, and it was going to move in a particular direction. Garrett had been filing a formal complaint about her scope violation, and now a resident he'd trained was filing a documented account of guidance that had contributed to a near-fatal cardiac arrest. These two things were going to exist in the same institutional space in the same week. She thought, I didn't do this. She thought it clearly and without equivocation, because it mattered to her to be honest with herself about what had happened. She had not orchestrated the resident's decision. She had not known about his log. She had not known he would send it. She had just done her work, consistently, thoroughly, for 6 years, and then yesterday, specifically, in the context that yesterday required. And the work was doing something now that she hadn't planned for it to do so. Commander Holt submitted the revised proposal at 11 a.m. Emily knew this because he sent her a brief text. They'd exchanged numbers that morning that read simply, filed, tightened per your note. Now we wait. She replied, okay. She went back to her patients. At 1:15, Dr. Marsh from Veterinary Services appeared on the trauma floor, which was unusual enough that Emily noticed before Marsh reached her. Marsh was the composed, dry-humored type, but she was walking with a slight quickening that suggested purpose. I have something to show you, Marsh said. Do you have 2 minutes? Maybe 3. Marsh produced her tablet and opened to a photograph. Shadow's harness. When I was doing the formal examination documentation yesterday, I logged all equipment, standard procedure. She turned the screen toward Emily. I found something I missed during the evaluation, inside the lining pouch. Commander Holt showed you the photograph, yes? Yes. There's also this. Marsh expanded a section of the photograph on her screen. In the leather pouch, visible beside the photograph, was a small piece of fabric, frayed at the edges, worn thin. A piece of cloth with a faded pattern that had once been more visible than it was now. Emily looked at it. The cloth was pale green with a narrow stripe. It was the corner of a kitchen towel, the kind sold in 4-packs, ordinary and forgettable, except that the pattern was specific enough that if you had seen it every day for 10 months in a kitchen where a dog slept under the table while you made coffee in the morning, you would know exactly what it was. "That's from my mother's house," Emily said. Her voice came out level. She was slightly surprised it came out level. "He's been carrying it," Marsh said quietly, "along with the photograph, the whole time." A pause. "I'm not a particularly sentimental person, Emily, but I thought you should see it." Emily looked at the screen, at the small worn square of green striped fabric that a dog had apparently carried for 9 years because it smelled like the first place that had ever felt safe. She handed the tablet back to Marsh. "Thank you," she said. She meant it in more ways than she could say, and said none of them. The meeting happened at 3 p.m. Emily was not in it. She was on the floor doing her work, but she knew it was happening because Dex, who had, she was increasingly convinced, a sixth sense for institutional weather patterns, appeared at her side at 2:55 with the quiet efficiency of a field update. Garrett, Calloway, Forsyth, the resident director, and 2 people from the military liaison office, he said. "Conference room B." "Okay." "The resident's documentation is apparently being reviewed." "Okay." "Emily." His voice dropped a register. I think this might actually be serious for him." She checked her watch. "I have a dressing change in 12. "Did you hear what I heard you." She looked at him. "Dex, I have a patient with a post-surgical infection who needs a dressing change in 12 minutes. Whatever is happening in conference room B is happening with or without my attention. My patient needs my attention." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Okay," he said. She went to do the dressing change. She was good at it, at the technical aspects and at the patient management aspects, which were different skills that had to run simultaneously. The patient in question was a younger man, 28, anxious in the way that physically capable people tended to be anxious when their bodies weren't cooperating, and she talked him through the procedure with the matter-of-fact clarity that she'd found worked better than false comfort. She was finishing when her phone buzzed. A text from Holt's number. "You need to come down to the administration corridor, now, if possible." She disposed of the gloves, confirmed the patient's chart was updated, and told the aide on the floor where she was going. The administration corridor was quieter than the patient floors, carpeted, the sounds absorbed differently, the particular quality of an institutional space that dealt with paper and decisions rather than bodies. Emily recognized the atmosphere the way she recognized the particular atmosphere of rooms where something had shifted and not yet settled. Holt was outside conference room B. He was standing with his arms at his sides, which was the rest position of someone who'd spent years learning not to show stress in their body. But his eyes, when she reached him, were alert in the specific way that came after something significant. "What happened?" she said. "Garrett withdrew the formal complaint," Holt said. Emily was quiet for a moment. "Voluntarily," she said. "Voluntarily is one word for it. The resident's documentation put him in a position where pressing your complaint would have drawn significantly more attention to the potassium guidance issue than he wanted." A pause. "Calloway said the liaison designation would go through provisional review. It's not approved yet, but the formal objection is gone." Emily processed this. Not with satisfaction exactly. It was too complicated for satisfaction, more like the sensation of something that had been held at a certain tension releasing, which was not always comfortable. "And the resident?" she asked. "Being reviewed separately, by the training program director." Holt's voice was measured. "He made a decision to document and report. That takes something. Garrett's going to make his life difficult. Garrett is going to have a difficult time doing that, given the current circumstances." A pause. "And I've made it clear to the liaison office that anyone who played a significant role in Shadow's evaluation, including the individuals who documented the process, has my formal attention, which is not nothing." Emily looked at the door to conference room B. "He's still in there," she said. "Yes." She looked at the door for a moment. She thought about what was inside it and what would come out of it eventually, and she thought about 6 years of doing the right thing in the right way, at the right cost, and watching it get categorized as adequate, as in its place, as lucky. She thought about a photograph in a leather pouch and a piece of green kitchen towel carried for 9 years. She thought, this isn't over. She knew that. Whatever was happening in that room was a shift, not an ending. Garrett would recalibrate. The institution would continue. The work would go on being what it was, unseen when it succeeded, questioned when it became visible. But something had moved today. She was certain of that. Something had moved that couldn't be moved back. I should get back to my floor, she said. Holt nodded once. Thank you, he said. It was the same phrase he'd used after Shadow's evaluation, but it landed differently now. Heavier, more specific, the gratitude of a man who understood exactly what he was thanking her for. She went back to her floor. She was passing the elevator bank when the doors opened and Garrett stepped out, and they came face to face in the corridor with approximately 2 feet between them and nothing to do about it but stand there for the half second it took to register. He looked at her. She looked at him. His expression was controlled in the specific way of someone managing the transition between what they'd just experienced and what they needed to perform in the next moment. His jaw was tight. There was something beneath the control she couldn't quite name. Not shame exactly, and not anger, but the near neighbor of both. He said, Your patient's on 14. The culture results from this morning's recheck. He paused. Clean. The antibiotics are working. She didn't know what to do with that. She hadn't expected him to say anything, and she hadn't expected that particular thing. Good, she said. He nodded once, the smallest possible acknowledgement, and walked past her. She watched him go. Then she turned around because behind her, 20 feet down the corridor, the door to the administrative wing had opened and Director Calloway had stepped out with the military liaison officer she hadn't recognized from Dex's description, and they were both looking at her with an expression she'd never had directed at her before, not in 6 years at Harlow Veterans Medical Center. It took her a moment to identify what the expression was. They were waiting for her. Not for Garrett, not for Holt, for her. Calloway said, Nurse Voss, do you have a moment? And something about the way he said it, the specific weight and formality of it, told Emily that whatever she walked through that door to hear, it was not going to be what any of the last 24 hours had prepared her for. Nurse Voss, do you have a moment? She said yes, the way you said yes to that question when the person asking it was the director of the hospital and the answer was never really optional. Calloway held the door and she walked through it, and the military liaison officer, whose name she still didn't know, followed them both inside. The administrative wing conference room was not Conference Room B, which was the larger one used for department meetings and reviews. This was a smaller space, used for the kind of conversations that didn't require a long table and a lot of chairs. 3 chairs. A window with the blinds half drawn against the gray afternoon light. A carafe of water that nobody had touched. Director Calloway was a man in his late 50s who had run Harlow for 11 years and had the specific quality of someone who had absorbed a great deal of institutional conflict over that period and learned to move through it without becoming either cynical or naive, which was harder than it sounded. He was not warm exactly, but he was fair in the way that careful people were fair, methodically, with documentation. The liaison officer introduced himself as Major Terrence Webb from the Military Medical Coordination Office. He had a firm handshake and the direct gaze of someone who had been trained to make people comfortable with authority, which was a different skill set than authority itself. Please sit down, Calloway said. Emily sat. She kept her hands on the table where she could see them. It was a habit she'd developed in patient rooms, an openness of posture that communicated availability. She wasn't sure why she defaulted to it here, but she did. I want to start by being direct, Calloway said, because I think you've earned that, and because I don't believe in having conversations around the edge of the actual subject. He folded his hands. The last 48 hours have surfaced a significant amount of information about the culture of this department. Not all of it is comfortable. Some of it requires action. I want you to understand where that process is and what it means for you specifically. Emily said nothing. She was listening with the full attention she gave to information that mattered. Dr. Garrett's formal complaint against you has been withdrawn, Calloway said. You may already know that. What you may not know is that in the course of reviewing that complaint and the circumstances surrounding it, We identified a pattern of documentation that is concerning. He paused. Specifically, regarding the management guidance provided to residents in his teaching cohort over the past 18 months. Emily was very still. The potassium threshold guidance, she said. Calloway looked at her for a moment. Among other things? How many patients? A brief pause. Calloway and Webb exchanged a look that was brief and professional and communicated something she wasn't meant to fully read. That review is ongoing, Calloway said. I'm not able to give you specific numbers before that process is complete. What I can tell you is that the resident who filed the account of his conversation with Garrett is not the only one who has come forward. 2 others have submitted similar statements to the training program director in the last 8 hours. Emily absorbed that. She thought about Alcala in the ICU. She thought about the specific way a number like 3.2 looked on a lab report beside a patient history that said post-catheterization and prior arrhythmia, and how someone who knew what to look for would see it, and someone who'd been told not to escalate borderline results would not. Is he still practicing? She asked. He is on administrative leave as of 2 hours ago, Calloway said, pending review. The word review did a lot of work in institutional settings. She knew what it meant and what it sometimes didn't mean. But administrative leave was something different. That was the institution putting distance between itself and a person, which was a meaningful act. What I'm about to ask you, Calloway said, is not an obligation. I want to be clear about that. You are not required to participate in anything beyond your standard patient care role. But the review panel that will be examining Dr. Garrett's departmental guidance practices is going to need clinical input from nursing staff, specifically from people who worked on the floor under the structure he managed. Emily looked at him. You want a witness account? She said. I want accurate clinical testimony from someone with 6 years of direct observation and a documented record that speaks for itself. Calloway's voice was careful and precise. Your documentation from yesterday, the Owens infection flag, the Alcala code response, those are part of the medical record. They speak to your clinical judgment independently. But if you're willing to also provide a formal account of what you observed in terms of departmental culture and practice guidance, that would be material. The room was quiet for a moment. Major Webb spoke for the first time, and his voice had a different quality than Calloway's. More direct, less institutionally cautious. Nurse Voss, Commander Holt submitted a formal account to our office this morning regarding Shadow's evaluation and your role in it. He included his assessment of your clinical competency as observed during the evaluation process, and he included the information about your history with Shadow. A pause. That account has been entered into our coordination file. It is a formal military record. It is not something that can be altered or erased by any action taken at the institutional level here. Emily looked at him. He did that this morning, she said. Not a question. Filed at 8:43 a.m., Webb said, before he submitted the liaison proposal to your administration. She thought about Holt in the break room at 6:58, the proposal on his tablet, the quiet economy of a man who planned several moves ahead and didn't announce them. I'll provide an account to the review panel, she said. Calloway nodded once. Thank you. But I want something from you first, Emily said. Calloway looked at her with the particular expression of a man who had expected this and was not bothered by it. What do you need? The residents who came forward, she said. Their training continuation shouldn't be affected by this. Whatever comes of the review, the people who told the truth should not carry the cost of having told it. Calloway was quiet for a moment. That's not entirely within my control. I know, but it's within your influence, and I'd like you to exercise it. Another brief pause. Then, I'll do what I can. He said it in a way that suggested he meant it, which was not nothing from a man who chose his language carefully. Emily stood. She shook Calloway's hand, then Webb's, and she walked back out into the administrative corridor with the sensation of someone who had been inside a room where the air pressure was different and was adjusting to the normal pressure of the hallway. She went back to her floor. This was the part that nobody who thought about justice thought about, the part after, where you went back to the floor and checked on your patients because your patients didn't pause for institutional proceedings. Owens needed his 3 o'clock check. The post-surgical patient in 20 needed a dressing review. There were charts to complete and handoff notes to write, and the floor moved at its own pace regardless of what was happening in the administrative wing. She did all of it. Dex materialized at 4:15 with the specific contained energy of someone sitting on an enormous amount of information. "Tell me," he said, walking beside her. "Just anything. I've been going insane out here." "Garrett's on administrative leave," she said. Dex stopped walking. She didn't. He caught up in 3 steps. "Administrative leave, pending review." She pushed through the door to the medication room. "I gave a preliminary account to Calloway. There's a formal review process starting." Dex was quiet for a full 4 seconds, which was a long time for Dex. "He's actually going to be held accountable." "I don't know what the outcome will be," she said. Because she didn't. She'd been in enough institutional processes to know that outcomes were not the same as intentions, and that held accountable covered a vast range that included things that looked like accountability and weren't. "But it's moving," Dex said. "It's moving," she agreed. She unlocked the medication cabinet and began her 4:15 pull with the same precision as every other day. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. "Emily," Dex said. She looked at him. He had the look of someone who wanted to say something significant and wasn't sure how to put it into a register that wasn't embarrassing for both of them. She watched him work through that for a moment. "You should have been seen a long time ago," he said. "What you do, how you do it. Someone should have said it a long time ago, and I'm saying it now because I should have said it before and I didn't." She held the medication tray and looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said. It was not an easy thing to accept. She'd gotten so practiced at not needing it that accepting it felt slightly foreign, like speaking a language she'd learned but rarely used. But she accepted it because Dex had offered it honestly and without calculation, and that deserved a real response. She went back to her patients. The evening passed the way evenings passed on the floor, in the accumulation of small necessary things, none of them dramatic, all of them important. By 8 p.m., the day shift was fully handed off, and Emily was in her coat, badge unclipped, keys in hand. Holt was in the lobby. She registered him before he registered her. He was looking toward the elevators, and she came from the stairwell because she almost always took the stairs, and she had a moment to see him before he adjusted. He looked tired, more so than the morning. The contained posture was still there but running lower, like a charge that hadn't been refreshed. "You didn't have to wait," she said. "I know." He said it simply, without apology. "I wanted to tell you in person. The liaison designation went through provisional approval. 6-week trial period. Full documentation, defined scope. If Shadow's next evaluation goes cleanly, it becomes permanent." "When you say cleanly?" "No scope violations, no unauthorized interventions." A pause, and something in his expression moved toward the dry end of the register. "Which I don't anticipate being a problem given that we've now explicitly defined the scope in writing." Emily almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "And Garrett?" Holt asked. "Administrative leave, review starting." She paused. 3 residents came forward. Holt was quiet for a moment. 3. Possibly more. It's ongoing. He looked at the hospital entrance, at the automatic doors and the gray evening beyond them. "I've been in a lot of institutions," he said. "Military, civilian, everything in between. The thing that makes them work or not work is whether the people inside them are willing to say the true thing when saying it costs something." He looked back at her. The resident who logged that conversation. The others who followed. "You, 6 years of showing up and doing the actual work." He paused. "It adds up. It takes a long time sometimes, but it adds up." Emily thought about this. She thought about it honestly, not in the way she'd have liked it to be true, but in the way she actually believed it, which were sometimes the same thing and sometimes not. "Sometimes it doesn't," she said. "Sometimes it doesn't," he agreed, "but this time it did." She could accept that. It was a more modest claim than the sweeping version, and it was the version she could hold as true. "Thank you," she said, "for the military record. This morning, before you would have figured it out," he said. "I just moved faster." "You moved faster," she said. "That mattered." He accepted that with a nod that was brief and genuine. She said goodnight and walked to the parking structure, and she sat in her car for only 4 minutes this time, which was progress. The next 3 days moved at the speed of institutional processes, which was not fast, but was faster than she'd expected. The review panel convened on the second day. Emily gave her formal account in the morning, in a room with a court reporter and two administrators and the training program director, whose name was Dr. Rita Harmon, and who had the focused, careful quality of someone who took the integrity of training programs personally. Emily spoke for 40 minutes. She answered questions directly. She provided dates and documentation references where she had them and noted clearly where she was working from professional observation rather than written record. Harmon asked her, at one point, "In your 6 years at Harlow, did you ever bring concerns about Dr. Garrett's guidance practices to a supervisor?" Emily considered the question carefully because it deserved a careful answer. "I raised concerns about specific patient management decisions on 3 occasions. Each time I was told the attending's judgment superseded nursing assessment unless there was an immediate emergency." "And you accepted that?" "I accepted it institutionally," Emily said. "I continued to flag what I flagged and document what I documented. I believed the record would eventually do what a direct confrontation probably couldn't." Harmon looked at her for a moment. "Do you still believe that?" "I think they work better together," Emily said. "The record and the confrontation. I had one without the other for a long time. Having both is faster." Harmon wrote something down. The 4th resident came forward on the 3rd day. His name was Dr. Jerome Pack, and he'd rotated through Garrett's cohort 8 months ago before transferring to a different teaching service for reasons he'd listed at the time as personal, which were apparently not personal. His account added a specific documented instance from 7 months prior in which a patient's deteriorating blood pressure had been categorized as acceptable by Garrett's standing guidance and had required emergency intervention 12 hours later. That patient had survived. The emergency intervention had worked. The incident had been written up as an acute deterioration, which was accurate in the narrow sense and incomplete in the larger one. Pack's account made the pattern undeniable. Emily found out about this from Harmon, who called her directly, a courtesy she hadn't expected, to inform her that the review had advanced to a formal disciplinary proceeding and that her account had been entered as primary evidence. She thanked Harmon and went back to work. Garrett appeared on the floor once during those 3 days. It was the 2nd day, late afternoon, and he came to collect personal items from his office near the department head suite. Emily was at the nurse's station, and she saw him come in, and she did not move or change what she was doing. He walked past the station without looking at her directly. She continued charting. He stopped. She was aware of him stopping without looking up. She finished the sentence she was writing and then looked up because she wasn't going to be caught not looking. He was standing 3 feet from the station counter. He looked smaller than he had 4 days ago. Not physically, nothing that visible, but in the specific way that people who operated from institutional authority looked smaller when that authority was in question. The edges of him were less defined. "The Alcala outcome," he said. His voice was controlled. She could hear the effort of the control. "I heard he's being stepped down from the ventilator." Alcala had made progress in the ICU. The cardiac team's note from that morning had used the word encouraging, which in ICU terms was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Yes, Emily said. Garrett nodded. He looked like he was going to say something else and then decided not to. He turned and walked toward his office. He got almost there before he turned back. "The potassium guidance," he said. He said it to the corridor, not specifically to her. "I believed it was clinically defensible. I want that on record somewhere, even if only here. I wasn't trying to harm anyone." Emily looked at him. She thought about what to say, and she thought about it genuinely. She thought about this difference between intent and outcome, which was a distinction that mattered in some contexts and was irrelevant in others. She thought about Alcala in VF on a table at 6 p.m. She thought about Pack's patient 7 months ago. "I believe you," she said. "That doesn't change what happened." Garrett held her gaze for a moment. Then he went into his office and closed the door. She went back to her chart. Shadow's scheduled 6-week follow-up arrived 14 days early. Holt called to tell her, and she could hear in his voice before he explained that the early visit wasn't routine. "He's regressing," Holt said. "The facility where he's staying, they're good people, but they don't know what they're doing with a dog that's processing this much. He won't eat. He's not sleeping." A pause. Dr. Marsh suggested moving up the evaluation. "I want you there." "When?" "Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. Can you adjust your shift?" She called the charge nurse and adjusted her shift. She was in the evaluation suite at 7:55, which was before Marsh arrived and before the handlers brought Shadow in. She stood in the room and looked at it. The examination table, the equipment along the wall, the same corridor visible through the door's narrow window. And she thought about what this room had looked like 12 days ago when a frightened dog had been braced against the wall and everyone was moving away from him. Shadow came in quietly. He was thinner than she remembered, though it had only been 12 days, which meant he'd dropped weight quickly. His coat was dull in the way that happened when animals weren't eating consistently, and the compensation in his rear left stride that Marsh had noted was more visible today. But his eyes came to her immediately, not frantically, not with the desperate scanning of the first visit. He found her and he stayed there, and something in his body that had been braced released by degree. She sat down on the floor. She heard one of the handlers exhale behind her. Shadow crossed the room and pressed his head against her knee, and she put her hand on the side of his neck where his pulse was faster than it should have been, but slower than the last time, and she sat there while the morning light came through the narrow window, and Marsh set up her equipment and the hospital did what hospitals did around them. "Hey," she said quietly, "I'm here." The evaluation took an hour. It was better than the first and worse than Emily wanted it to be. The weight loss concerned Marsh, the joint inflammation had progressed slightly, and the behavioral regression suggested Shadow was not adapting to the current facility in the way they'd hoped. "He needs a different environment," Marsh said, at the end, writing her notes. "The facility he's in is set up for active working dogs. Structured, high routine, limited individual attention. That's wrong for a retired animal processing a major transition." She looked at Holt. "He needs somewhere quieter. Smaller. Ideally, one primary caregiver." Holt was quiet for a moment. Emily was still on the floor. Shadow had shifted to sit beside her rather than pressing against her knee, but he hadn't moved away from her. "I'm in temporary housing," Holt said. "Until the base assignment is confirmed. I can't take him into a hotel." Marsh looked at her notes. "I know that." She looked up. "I was thinking about something more specific." She looked at Emily. Emily looked at Marsh. "I'm in a rental," Emily said. "I'm on the 3rd floor. There's no yard." "There's a park 2 blocks from your building," Holt said. She looked at him. "You know where I live?" "I processed the liaison paperwork. Your address is on the employment file." He said it without apology, but without aggression. Just fact. "I'm not suggesting anything. Marsh is suggesting something, and I'm noting that the logistical objection you raised has a logistical answer." Emily looked at Shadow. Shadow looked back at her with the particular quality of a patient animal who had learned to wait for the right answer rather than demand the fast one. "This would be a medical placement," Marsh said carefully. "Formally through my office. Temporary, documented. It addresses Shadow's welfare needs as identified in today's evaluation." A pause. "It would also be relevant context for the permanent liaison designation." Emily absorbed the layered nature of that statement. It was simultaneously straightforward and strategic, which was the kind of offer that required you to sit with both aspects honestly. "How temporary?" she asked. "Until Commander Holt's permanent assignment is confirmed and he has appropriate housing," Marsh said. "Estimated 8 to 12 weeks." Shadow pressed his shoulder against her knee. She looked at Holt. He was watching her with the composed, waiting expression of a man who had learned to let other people make their own decisions and mean them. "I'll need formals documentation from your office," Emily told Marsh. "I'll have it this afternoon," Marsh said. Emily looked at Shadow once more, at the thin coat and the tired eyes and the way he'd found her in the room without hesitation, without doubt, the way a compass found north. "Okay," she said. She said it once, clearly, and she meant it. The formal disciplinary proceeding against Garrett was scheduled for 2 weeks out. Emily knew this from Harmon's office, which had sent her a confirmation of her witness status along with the time and date. She'd noted it in her calendar and returned to her work. What she didn't know, what she found out late on the 4th day following Shadow's early evaluation from a source she did not expect, was that Garrett had not waited for the proceeding. He had submitted a voluntary resignation. She found out from Forsyth, who appeared at the nurses' station at 5:50 p.m. with the specific look of someone carrying news that was still settling in their own mind. "He submitted it this afternoon," Forsyth said. Her voice was even. Whatever she felt about it, she was keeping below the surface. "Effective end of month." Emily said nothing for a moment. "The proceeding still happens," Forsyth said. "For the record, Regardless of whether he's still employed here. She paused. His residents are being reassigned to Dr. Okafor's cohort. Harmon is doing individual check-ins with all of them. Good, Emily said. It's not how I expected this to end, Forsyth said. It hasn't ended, Emily said. There's still the review, the record, whatever findings they publish. She paused. And his residents are going to need people who model the actual standard for a while. That takes longer than a proceeding. Forsyth looked at her for a moment. You're going to be watching them. I watch everyone, Emily said. That's the job. Forsyth almost smiled. It was a tired, genuine, complicated smile. The kind that came from being in the middle of something that had been a long time arriving, and now that it was here, the arrival itself was heavier than the anticipation. There's a department meeting tomorrow morning, Forsyth said. Calloway wants to address the whole floor. He's asked if you'd be willing to speak. Emily looked at her. About what? About what good clinical judgment looks like, Forsyth said. About documentation culture. About, I think the actual phrase he used was setting the standard. A brief pause. He didn't frame it as mandatory. Emily picked up her pen. She had 3 chart entries she needed to complete before handoff. Tell him yes, she said. She turned back to her charts. Behind her, she heard Forsyth walk away, and the floor continued its evening sounds. The soft urgency of it, the constant, careful motion of people doing necessary work without fanfare. She finished her first entry, started the second. She was halfway through it when her phone buzzed, a text from Holt's number. She picked it up and read it. It was a photograph. Shadow, in what was clearly Holt's temporary housing, a hotel room, the background visible. I was lying on the floor beside the bed with his chin resting on what appeared to be a worn, green-striped kitchen towel, placed there intentionally, in the way that people sometimes place things for animals, the way they'd place them for a person. The caption read, "Slept 4 hours straight. First time in 2 weeks." Emily looked at the photograph for a moment, at the thin dog with the old eyes and the quiet face, resting against something that meant safety. She typed back, "Documentation from Marsh came through. I'll clear space in the hallway for his bed." She put the phone down. She picked up her pen and finished the chart. She was good at this. The real kind, as Owens had said. Not the performance of it, but the actual labor, which was quiet and persistent and expensive in the ways that mattered, and invisible in the ways that most people noticed. For 6 years she had done it alone, in her place at the level they'd assigned her. Tomorrow morning she was going to stand in front of her department and tell them what the standard was, clearly and without apology, and they were going to listen. She finished the last chart entry, capped her pen, and for one moment allowed herself to sit in the particular quiet of having done the work completely. Then she stood, clipped her badge, picked up her bag, and walked toward the elevator. And she almost didn't notice the envelope on the nurse's station counter until she was 2 steps past it, and some peripheral instinct pulled her back. It was a standard inter-office envelope, sealed, with her name written on the front in handwriting she recognized because she'd seen it on department memos for 6 years. Garrett's handwriting. She picked it up. It was light, a single sheet inside, nothing more. She looked at it for a long moment without opening it, standing at the counter of the nurse's station at 5:58 p.m., with the floor moving around her in its ordinary evening way. She opened it. The note inside was 1 paragraph, handwritten. She read it once. Then she folded it carefully, put it in her breast pocket beside the photograph she still carried, and walked to the elevator. She pressed the button for the lobby. The doors closed. In her pocket, the note said, "I know what you saw. I know what you didn't report directly. I know you chose documentation over confrontation, and I want you to understand. That choice gave me 6 years I shouldn't have had. I am not writing this to make you responsible for my decisions. I am writing it because you deserve to know that I know. And because what I said about you in that corridor was wrong. Not tactically wrong. Wrong." The elevator descended. Emily stood in it with her hands at her sides and her face still, and the particular complicated weight of a thing fully understood settled into her. Not comfortable, not triumphant, but real, the way things were real when they were finally allowed to be exactly what they were. The doors opened at the lobby. She walked out. She walked out into the evening air and stood on the hospital steps for exactly the amount of time it took to take 2 full breaths, and then she walked to her car. The drive home was 22 minutes. She knew the route well enough to take it without attention, which left the rest of her mind to sit with the note in her pocket and process it the same way she processed everything, steadily, without rushing toward a conclusion, letting it be as complicated as it actually was. Garrett had known. For 6 years, at some level that he'd kept below articulation, he had known what she was doing and what it cost her, and he had done what people did when they knew they were benefiting from someone else's disadvantage and couldn't stop themselves. He had minimized her, not because he didn't see her, but because seeing her clearly required him to see himself clearly, and that was the harder thing. She didn't forgive him for it. That wasn't what the note asked for, and she didn't have it to give anyway. Not yet, maybe not for a long time. But she understood it. Understanding was its own kind of work, different from forgiveness, not lesser. She pulled into the parking structure under her building and sat in the car for 2 minutes. Not processing this time, just sitting, allowing the day to be what it was before she carried it inside. Then she went upstairs. Shadow arrived 4 days later. Holt drove him from the temporary facility in a rented SUV with the back seat folded down and a blanket spread across the cargo area, which Shadow had apparently spent the entire drive lying on with his head up, watching the road. Emily was at her building's entrance when the car pulled in, and she watched Holt open the rear hatch and Shadow step down with the careful deliberateness of a dog managing old joints on a new surface. Shadow looked at the building. He looked at the street. He looked at Emily. He walked to her. He didn't rush. He crossed the sidewalk at a measured pace, sniffed her hand once, and then stood beside her left leg in the particular position she'd started thinking of as his default. Not pressed against her, just close. The distance that meant present without demanding. He ate this morning, Holt said. He was getting a bag from the back of the car. Full bowl. Good. He watched me pack his things. Holt said it with the dry understatement of a man describing something he hadn't expected to feel anything about, and had. Just sat there and watched, like he was making sure everything went in. Emily looked down at Shadow. Smart. Annoyingly so, Holt said. She took them upstairs. The apartment was on the smaller side. She'd never needed much space and had never particularly wanted it. But she'd cleared the corner of the living room near the radiator, which ran warm in the evenings, and put down the bed Marcia's office had requisitioned, and positioned it so Shadow would have sightlines to both the front door and the hallway without having to move. She'd read enough about working dog behavior to know that visual access to exits mattered, that an animal who'd spent years operating in high-stakes environments needed to be able to see the way out even when they didn't need to use it. Shadow went directly to the bed, circled it once, counterclockwise, and lay down. Holt stood in the living room doorway with the bag and looked at the dog on the bed and at the corner that had clearly been prepared for exactly this, and something crossed his expression that was private enough that Emily looked away to give it space. I'll be by on Saturdays, he said. If that works. That works? He put the bag down near the door. He looked like he had more to say and was editing it. Thank you, he said finally. For this. For all of it. He's good company, Emily said. I've been told I'm difficult to live with. Holt looked at her. Who told you that? No one specific. The general impression. The general impression of people who prefer things simple, Holt said, and left it at that, and left. Emily closed the door. She stood in her living room. Shadow lifted his head from the bed and looked at her. Okay, she said. Ground rules. Shadow put his head back down. She wasn't sure if that was agreement or dismissal. She decided it was both and went to make dinner. The department meeting was on a Thursday morning, 8 a.m., in the main conference room on the second floor, where all-hands communications happened. Emily arrived at 7:50 and stood near the back while the room filled. She watched people come in and find seats and talk to each other in the low-energy way of hospital staff in the early morning, half-present, caffeine-dependent, carrying the weight of yesterday's shift into the start of today's. Calloway came in at 7:58. He sat up at the front of the room with the organized efficiency of a man who respected other people's time as a matter of principle. Forsyth was beside him, Harmon was there, and Major Webb from the liaison office, which was a more significant presence than Emily had expected. At 8 exactly, Calloway started. He didn't soften it. She'd expected him to contextualize it, to build up to the substance with institutional preamble, but he didn't. He said directly and in plain language what had happened, A department head's guidance practice had contributed to a pattern of undertreated patient risk over an 18-month period. 4 residents had filed documented accounts. A formal review had found the pattern substantiated. Dr. Garrett had submitted a voluntary resignation, which did not end the formal process. Findings would be published and would become part of the hospital's accreditation record. The room was very quiet. Calloway let it be quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The reason this surfaced when it did, and not later, and not worse, is because of people on this floor who kept accurate records of their own observations and clinical decisions, and because of one specific situation that created the conditions for those records to be seen." He paused. "I want to acknowledge that explicitly, and I want to acknowledge who was at the center of it." Emily had been told this was coming. She had agreed to speak. She had not agreed to be introduced exactly, and so when Calloway said her name and looked at her across the room, she registered the 30-odd sets of eyes that followed his gaze, and she held very still. "Nurse Voss," Calloway said, "I'd like you to say what you told me when I asked you about this, about documentation culture, about what good clinical judgment looks like from the floor level, because I think it needs to be heard from you and not from me." Emily moved from the back of the room to the front. She didn't have notes. She'd thought about writing some and decided against it because notes would have let her edit toward what sounded right instead of what was true, and the difference between those things was the whole point. She stood in front of the room and looked at the people in it. Nurses she'd worked beside for years, residents she knew by face and some by name, a few administrators, Forsyth and Harmon and Webb. She said, "I want to start by saying that I'm not standing here because I did something heroic. I sat on a floor and a dog walked up to me, and that led to a chain of events that I didn't plan and couldn't have predicted. The things that came after that, the infection I flagged, the code I responded to, those were my ordinary work. I need that to be clear because what I'm about to say is about ordinary work, and it only lands right if you understand that's what I'm describing." She paused. 6 years ago, when I started on this floor, I was told, in various ways, to stay in my lane, to escalate within the chain and then let it go, to document my concerns and trust that someone above me would act on them. And I did that. I documented, every day, not because I was building a case, because documentation is how I was taught, and because it seemed like the right way to do the work. She looked at the room, not at one person, but at the general weight of it. What I know now, and didn't know then, is that documentation alone isn't enough. Documentation without the willingness to be seen holding it is just a record in a file that nobody looks at until something goes wrong. She let that sit for a moment. What happened last week happened because a resident looked at something that was wrong and wrote it down and then sent that documentation to the people who needed to see it. That took more courage than anything I did. He's 26 years old and he risked his training placement and he did it anyway. 3 others followed him. She paused. That's the standard. Not what I did. What they did. Because they did it in real time, at real cost, in the moment when it mattered, instead of waiting until the moment had already passed. The room was still listening. She could feel it, the specific quality of collective attention that was genuine rather than polite. "The lesson I take from this," Emily said, "is that the most important clinical skill is not technical. It's honesty about what you're seeing, honesty with your chart, honesty with your supervisor, honesty with yourself when you know something is wrong, and the easiest thing is to decide it's probably fine." A pause. It's almost never fine. And the cost of deciding it's probably fine is almost always paid by the patient. She looked at the residents specifically. The 3 who'd come forward were there. She knew their faces now, had made a point of learning them. They didn't look vindicated exactly. They looked tired in the way of people who had done the right thing and were still processing the shape of that. "Thank you," she said, "for the record. For everyone who kept an honest record even when you weren't sure anyone was looking. Someone is always looking, even when it doesn't feel like it." She stepped back. The applause started slowly. Not the performed kind, not the automatic convention of professional gatherings, but the kind that built because people were actually responding to something. Forsyth was clapping. Webb was clapping. Harmon had the expression of a woman who had run training program reviews for 15 years and was recalibrating something. Emily looked at her hands. She wasn't comfortable with the sound of it, but she didn't look away from it either, because looking away would have been another kind of dishonesty. And she'd just finished talking about honesty. She let it happen. She accepted it. She stood there and accepted it. The formal review findings were published 3 weeks later. They were not gentle. The document, 22 pages, distributed to department heads, the accreditation body, and the military liaison office, found that Dr. Garrett's guidance practices had created a systematic pattern of undertreated clinical risk across his teaching cohort, resulting in 4 documented patient incidents, of which 2 had required emergency intervention. The findings recommended remediation of the training program's oversight protocols and the development of a formal escalation culture framework for all resident cohorts. Garrett was not practicing at Harlow. He was not, as far as Emily knew, practicing anywhere immediately. The findings would follow him to any credentialing body he applied to, which was the institutional consequence that couldn't be resigned away. Whatever he did next, he would do it with that record preceding him, visible to anyone who looked. She thought about the note in her pocket. She'd transferred it from her work jacket to her personal notebook at home, folded small, not because she wanted to revisit it often, but because discarding it had felt like erasing something she owed herself to remember. He had known, and knowing had not been enough. She held that, and she let it be complicated, and she went on. The disciplinary proceeding, which happened on the second Thursday after the findings were published, was the only time Emily was in the same room as Garrett again. It was formal, and it was precise, and it lasted 4 hours, during which Emily gave her account a second time for the official record. She kept it to the facts and the documentation. She didn't editorialize. She didn't add the weight of 6 years of smaller, unrecorded moments, because the record that was there was enough. It was more than enough. It was complete, and adding to it would have been reaching for something she didn't need. Garrett sat through it in the controlled stillness of a man who had made his peace with the process, or was performing having made peace with it, and she was honest with herself about not knowing which. When it was over, he left by the side door. She didn't watch him go. She signed the final witness form, collected her copy of the documentation, and walked out the main entrance into a Thursday afternoon that was bright for Dunmore. Actual sun, the kind that came through the Pacific Northwest clouds 3 or 4 times in September, like a reminder that the clouds were a choice, not a permanent condition. She stood on the steps. She thought, it's done. Not perfectly. Not in the way it would have gone in a version of this where institutions worked the way they were supposed to work from the beginning, but done, in the imperfect, incomplete, finally over way that real things ended. Not with clean resolution, but with the weight lifting enough to breathe differently. Her phone buzzed. Holt, Saturday still works. Shadow ate breakfast and then sat in front of the door for 20 minutes, waiting for something. I think he knows. She typed back, I'll take him to the park first. There's a trail section he likes. A pause. Then, how do you know he likes it? She'd taken Shadow to the park every morning for 11 days. She knew which section of trail he preferred because he walked differently on it. Not faster, just more settled. The particular ease of an animal in the right environment. She knew he liked the bench near the east entrance because he always paused there, and she'd started sitting on it for a few minutes each morning, and he'd sit beside her and watch the other dogs from a comfortable distance. She typed, he told me. Holt sent back, fair enough. She put her phone in her pocket and walked to her car. 6 weeks after Shadow came to stay, Dr. Lauren Marsh completed her formal evaluation and signed the permanent foster care designation paperwork. The document specified that Shadow, retired military working dog, service number, and registry ID included, would remain in the care of Emily Voss pending Commander Marcus Holt's permanent assignment status. It also specified, in a paragraph that Marsh had clearly written carefully, that the arrangement had demonstrated significant positive impact on the animal's physical and psychological recovery indicators and was recommended for continuation regardless of Commander Holt's housing status. That last paragraph had been Marsh's addition. Emily knew because Marsh told her. It means, Marsh said, over coffee, in the hospital's small ground floor cafe, in the dry and efficient way she communicated most things, that if Holt gets his permanent assignment and has appropriate housing, the designation can still be maintained as primary care, if he wants it that way. Emily looked at her coffee. That's a significant thing to put in a formal document, she said. It's an accurate thing, Marsh said. Shadow's weight is up 4 pounds. His joint inflammation markers are down. He's sleeping through the night. She took a sip of her coffee. He follows you around your apartment, I assume. He follows me to the kitchen when I make breakfast. Of course he does. Marsh set her cup down. Emily, he was carrying a piece of cloth from your mother's kitchen for 9 years. He's not going to stop following you around because of a document. A pause. I just made sure the document reflects that. Emily looked at her for a moment, at Marsh's dry, composed face and the genuine care running underneath it that she mostly didn't draw attention to. Thank you, Emily said. Don't, Marsh said. It's clinical documentation. I'm not doing you a favor, I'm doing my job correctly, which is what we're all supposed to be doing. She picked up her coffee again. I heard your speech at the department meeting. Oh. It was good. A little earnest in the middle, but good. She paused. The part about documentation without visibility being a file nobody looks at. I'm using that, in my practice guidelines. With credit. Emily almost smiled. That's fine. Good. Marsh stood. Bring Shadow in for the 2-month check on the 14th. I want to recheck the joint inflammation. She left. Emily finished her coffee. The civilian-military liaison designation, the formal one, the permanent one, with the defined scope, and the documented authorization, was approved on the same day as Shadow's permanent foster paperwork, which Holt said was a coincidence and Marsh said was scheduling efficiency, and Emily suspected was Marsh being strategically organized about the timing. The designation meant that Emily was formally listed as a civilian clinical resource for military working animal evaluations at Harlow Veterans Medical Center. It was a narrow scope, exactly as narrow as she'd told Holt to write it. But it was official, it was on record, and it was hers. There was no ceremony. There was a piece of paper with signatures, which Calloway's office sent to her department mailbox with a standard cover memo. She found it between a benefits renewal notice and a cafeteria menu update. She took it home and put it in the drawer where she kept important documents. Shadow watched her do this from his bed in the corner, chin resting on the green striped towel that she'd found in a box in her storage unit and put in his space deliberately. That's the one, she told him. He blinked slowly and put his head down. Bam. Holt got his permanent assignment confirmed in the 8th week. Fort Harlow, the base associated with Harlow Veterans Medical Center, had an opening in the Senior Medical Coordination Office, which was unusual enough positioning that she suspected he'd had some influence on the outcome, though she didn't ask. He found a house 11 minutes from the hospital with a fenced yard and hardwood floors and a back bedroom he said he planned to set up as an office. He told her on a Saturday, in the park, while Shadow investigated a section of undergrowth near the East Trail with the focused seriousness he brought to undergrowth investigations. So he comes home, Emily said. He comes home, Holt agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Shadow emerged from the undergrowth, looked at both of them, and chose to sit beside Emily's left leg, which Holt observed with the dry, accepting expression of a man who had settled his expectations about this some time ago. The designation stays, Holt said. The paperwork Marsh filed. That's independent of where he lives. I know. And I'd like to maintain the arrangement, the Saturday visits. He paused. If you're willing. He does better here. Not here specifically, in the park. I mean, you know what I mean. I know what you mean, she said. Shadow had relocated to lean against Holt's leg, the shoulder-to-calf contact of an animal distributing his loyalty equitably. Saturday works, Emily said. They walked the rest of the trail loop in the particular comfortable silence of two people who had been through something significant together and didn't need to narrate it. In the months that followed, the things that changed slowly. The escalation framework that the review had recommended was developed by a committee that included 2 of Garrett's former residents, and at Harmon's specific request, Emily. It took 4 months of meetings and 2 full rewrites, and the final document was not perfect. It had compromises in it, places where institutional caution had won out over clinical clarity, but it was real. It would be used. She'd made sure, in the committee meetings, that the places where it mattered most were as strong as they could be. The residents found their footing under Dr. Okafor's cohort. 2 of them sought Emily out specifically, separately, over the course of those months, not to talk about what had happened, but to ask clinical questions, judgment questions, the kind of questions that meant they were paying attention to the right things and looking for people who paid attention to the right things. She answered them directly and without fanfare. She checked in on their documentation habits without making it a thing. She noticed when they caught something and said so clearly in front of people. She became, without intending to and without particularly announcing it, the person people brought the hard questions to. Not the administrative questions or the hierarchy questions. Those went where they'd always gone. The clinical judgment questions. The ones that didn't have a clean protocol answer. The ones that required someone to say, here's what I see, here's what it means, here's what to do about it. She was not perfect at this. She was too direct sometimes, in ways that didn't account for how scared the person across from her was. She got impatient occasionally with questions she thought were obvious, and had to remind herself that obvious was a function of experience, not intelligence, and that she'd had a version of these questions herself once. She got it wrong sometimes. She noted when she got it wrong, she corrected course. She continued. This was what she had to offer. Not a clean transformation, not a version of herself without flaws. Just the accumulated practice of paying attention and being honest about what she saw, repeated daily, at the specific cost that honesty required. Shadow's one-year retired service assessment, the formal annual evaluation that all retired military working dogs in the program underwent, happened on a Tuesday in the late spring. He walked into the evaluation suite at Harlow on a lead held by Holt, and when the door opened, he didn't freeze, didn't scan frantically, didn't require any special management. He walked in, found Emily where she was sitting in the chair near the wall, and went directly to her. He was calmer than he'd been a year ago. The joint inflammation was managed. He was on a supplement regimen that Marsh had dialed in over 6 months of adjustments, and the weight he'd regained had stayed on. His coat had the quality of an animal who was sleeping consistently and eating well and spending time in environments that didn't require constant alertness. The haunted quality was gone from his eyes, replaced by something slower and more settled, the particular look of an animal who had found out late in life that rest was possible. Marsh ran the evaluation with her usual dry efficiency. The assessment took 45 minutes. When she finished, she noted the results in her documentation with the kind of one-word summaries she favored. Stable, she said. Better than stable. Thriving, if I'm using that word for a dog, which I apparently am. Holt made a sound that was very close to a laugh. His rear left joint is managing well. Cognition indicators are strong. Temperament, significantly improved from baseline. Marsh looked up. That's the official finding. She paused. The unofficial finding is that he's a different dog than the one who came through that door 14 months ago, and both of you know why. She closed her folder. I'll see him in 6 months, she said, and left. Holt looked at Shadow, who was sitting beside Emily's chair with his head resting on her knee in the position he defaulted to when he was completely comfortable. I want to tell you something, Holt said. Emily looked at him. When I requested you for the liaison designation, I told Calloway it was about Shadow's welfare and clinical data. He paused. That was true. But it was also, I needed someone in this institution to be seen for what they actually were, and I knew that if I pushed, the scene would happen alongside everything else. He looked at Shadow, then back at her. I want you to know that it wasn't purely tactical. It mattered to me that you got seen. Emily was quiet for a moment. This was the part of being acknowledged that she'd never gotten good at. Not the professional acknowledgement, which she'd learned to accept with some grace, but the personal kind. The kind that came from someone seeing not just the work, but the person doing it and what it had cost them. I know, she said. Thank you for that. It wasn't everything she could have said. It was enough. Shadow pressed his head more firmly against her knee. She put her hand on him. She thought sometimes about what the story of the last year looked like from the outside. A retired military dog brought for an evaluation. A nurse nobody paid attention to who sat down on the floor. A photograph in a leather harness. The chain of things that followed. From the outside, it looked like a sequence of events. From the inside, it felt like the long, slow outcome of 6 years of showing up and doing the work accurately and not stopping when accuracy felt like it wasn't doing anything, which it often felt like. The truth was somewhere between those two views, as it usually was. The events had been real and the sequence had mattered. And the work had been real and the accumulation had mattered. Neither one alone would have been enough. Both together, at the moment when they converged, had been more than enough. She didn't think of herself as a person things happened to. She thought of herself as a person who kept doing the same thing, paying attention, recording accurately, acting on what she saw. until the things she'd been paying attention to became visible enough that other people could see them too. That was the shape of it. Not heroic, not clean, just persistent, in the way that only persistence could be, through the long stretches when it felt like nothing was moving, and the smaller stretches when something finally did. On a Saturday morning in early summer, Shadow walked the East Trail at full pace for the first time. He'd been building up to it. Marsh had cleared him for moderate activity in March, and he'd been extending the distances gradually in the way that rehabilitating animals did. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the accumulated small expansions of what was possible. Today, he walked the full loop without slowing. Emily walked beside him. The morning was the kind of morning Dunmore offered 3 or 4 times in a good summer. Clear sky, the air carrying the particular quality of somewhere close to water, the light at an angle that made everything look considered. Shadow walked with his head up and his ears forward, the working dog posture of an animal paying full, interested attention to the world, and it was beautiful in the unsentimental way that real things were beautiful, not because it was perfect, but because it had been hard, and it had happened anyway. At the bench near the east entrance, she stopped. He stopped with her. She sat down. He sat beside her. They stayed there for a few minutes, watching the park wake up around them. Joggers. A family with a stroller. 2 other dogs on leads, which Shadow observed with the calm assessment of an animal who had stopped feeling the need to react to every variable. She thought about a younger version of herself in a kitchen with afternoon light coming through those particular windows, and a dog who slept under her bed for 6 weeks until he understood that the under the bed was safe, and the time between that and this, which had not been a straight line, which had gone through things she would not have chosen and would not have skipped, because the skipping would have removed the arriving. She thought about the note in her drawer, folded small. She thought about Dex's face the morning after the department meeting, and Forsyth's tired, sincere smile, and Harmon saying, "I'm using that," with credit. She thought about Calloway's office sending a form letter with a piece of paper that said, "This is yours. Officially, it has always been yours." She thought about what it meant to be seen, finally, and how it was better and stranger and less complete than she'd imagined, because she was still herself inside it, still imperfect, still too direct sometimes, still carrying things she hadn't fully processed. The recognition hadn't fixed any of that. She hadn't expected it to. What it had done was make the room bigger, made it possible to show people what she was doing and why, to bring the next person forward, to be the one who said, "That's good work," out loud in front of the people who needed to hear it said. That was the actual prize, not the designation on paper, not the meeting speech, the room that was bigger now, and the people who could fit inside it. Shadow leaned his shoulder against her leg. She put her hand on him, warm fur, and the steady pulse of a heart that had found its rest. "Good boy," she said. She meant it the same way she always had, not as a reward, not as praise for performance, but as the simplest possible accurate statement about what she saw in front of her. A loyal, complicated, imperfect creature who had carried what mattered to him for 9 years through everything, and had not let go. The morning continued. She sat with him until the bench's shade shifted and the park was fully awake around them. And then she stood, and he stood, and they walked back the way they'd come. Not everything had changed. The work was still the same work, daily, unglamorous, requiring things from her that weren't always easy to give. The institution was still an institution, which meant it would generate new frictions and new people who needed to be navigated carefully, and new moments where the right thing and the easy thing were not the same thing. She would still be the person who chose the right thing and didn't announce it, because that was the version of herself she knew how to be. What was different was that she'd stopped waiting for the choosing to be enough on its own. She'd learned to hold the choosing and the visibility at the same time, to do the work and to be seen doing it, to document and to speak, to be patient and to also refuse to be silent. The woman who sat on the cold floor of a hospital corridor and waited for a frightened dog to come to her had already known that stillness was its own kind of strength. What she knew now, that she hadn't fully known then, was that strength required witnesses, that the most precise act of quiet power meant nothing if it never became visible enough for the people watching to understand what they'd seen. She had been visible, finally. She intended to stay that way.